Hey biology students! In this second lecture video, we are going to talk about the non-vascular plants. These are also referred to as the bryophytes. On the screen, can you identify the bryophyte in the picture? So the bryophyte in the picture looks a lot like green carpeting. Of course, this organism is called a moss. So let's outline it in the picture. Growing like carpeting on the forest floor, this would be moss. So moss is an example of one of the bryophytes. So bryophytes fall into three different categories. So the bryophytes include mosses, what are called hornworts, and liverworts. So what traits do these plants have in common? Well, these plants would have evolved following the evolutionary event of moving the common ancestor, the green algae, which remember was very dependent on water, to land. And so that's why moss in particular looks a lot like algae, but it's algae that adapted to life on land. So these plants are a very ancient group of plants that evolved on Earth as the first land plants. And this was approximately 475 million years ago. So even though they are our first land plants, they really don't have true roots. They have something that's root-like. So they really are dependent on being close to a water source. Because they can't transport their water very far distances, they lack vascular tissue, which is a transport tissue that plants use for moving water and minerals from roots to leaves, and they lack that. This is why they're called non-vascular plants. They also require water for fertilization for their sexual life cycle. Their sperm swim, and the swimming sperm will travel to the egg by water. Again, they're very small, usually only a few centimeters in length, and they require damp areas. It is possible to see mosses attached to rocks as long as there's enough moisture. We refer to the bryophytes in their alternation of generation life cycle as gametophyte dominant. What that means is it is the largest structure, and it is also this the structure that the sporophyte relies on for nutrition. Okay, so we want to keep that in mind as we look at the different plant groups. Which plant groups are gametophyte dominant and which plant groups are sporophyte dominant? So the bryophytes are the only group that's gametophyte dominant. So we're going to discuss the alternation of generations life cycle specific to the bryophytes. So recall in the first lecture video, we discussed the alternation of generations life cycle of all plants. So all plants followed this life cycle. If we want to go in order of the numbers on the slide, recall there's a multicellular haploid gametophyte or gamete-producing plant. That plant produces gametes by mitosis. Those gametes are egg cells and sperm cells. Fertilization results when the egg and the sperm combine their genetic information and form the zygote. The zygote is diploid, because it has genetic information from both the egg cell and the sperm cell. In fact, a zygote is just a fertilized egg. That zygote is single-celled or unicellular, but it grows by mitosis or divides and forms many identical copies of itself, and that becomes the multicellular diploid form of the plant we call the sporophyte. The sporophyte is the spore-producing plant. It produces spores by meiosis. This is what creates the genetic diversity of plants and their life cycle. And it produces unique spores that are haploid. Those spores will divide by mitosis, so a single spore will divide by mitosis and produce a new plant. The new plant is referred to as the gametophyte structure. So now let's apply this general life cycle to how it works in the moss. So although there are 3 different types of bryophytes, we're going to focus on the moss. And so remember, mosses are gametophyte dominant. That is the largest structure, it's the most visible structure, and it's also the structure where photosynthesis happens. So photosynthesis happens in the gametophyte. So when you're looking at moss without a microscope, and you just see it on the surface of a rock or on the bottom of or on the soil, just on the surface of the soil, maybe in a damp forest, it looks like a green carpeting, right? Well, what are you seeing? You're seeing the gametophyte. So the green part, the part that looks like the carpet of the plant, if we use that analogy that moss is like the carpet of the forest, what you're seeing is the gametophyte. So let's label this part the gametophyte. Now this is the cartoon drawing here on the left, but we see what this really looks like under a microscope to the right. You don't have to use a microscope to see the sporophyte and the gametophyte of mosses, but usually when we do the lab portion of the course, we use a type of microscope that magnifies this by about 3 times its actual size, so that you can see these little sprouts coming out of the gametophyte plant, which are of course the sporophyte. So in this picture, we're seeing that the gametophyte and the sporophyte coexist together as 2 different structures of the same plant. So the gametophyte is the bottom part. It's the part where we have these root-like structures, and it's the green part with these leaves that performs the photosynthesis. And of course, it's also the part that makes gametes. Now, so all of this would be gametophyte. And all of this, the sprout that you see coming out of the gametophyte, this part is called the sporophyte. So here you could see how that actually looks. So there are these little sprouts that are coming out of the gametophyte with these little pods on the ends. And these little pods, we call this little pod, we call it the capsule. It's part of the sporophyte. And then we see these little dots that are coming out of the capsule. What are these little dots? Well, if that's the sporophyte, what do you think it is? Sporophyte means spore-producing plant. Therefore, this is the structure of the plant that makes the spores. So these would be spores. Now let's look at that in a little more detail. So this is the life cycle illustration that we're going to use to explain the moss life cycle. You have this in your PowerPoint slides, and I recommend that you fill this out with me as we go through and describe the stages. what I'm going to do is I'm going to animate this by only showing you one part of the life cycle at a time. So we focus on that. So we're going to start by just looking at the adult structure of the moss. So the mature structure of the moss has both the gametophyte and the sporophyte on the same plant. And you can see that the sporophyte is dependent on the gametophyte for nutrition. So the green part, the bottom part, is the gametophyte. And this stalk that's coming out with the little pod, we call the capsule, okay, that would be sporophyte. There's a reason why we're looking at this visually, guys. You need to be able to identify the different parts of the plant, the sporophyte and the gametophyte parts, as they visually present themselves in the different plant groups. So of the 4 plant groups, the gametophyte and the sporophytes all look different. And you need to know what they are and what they look like. Okay, so let's talk about what the sporophyte does. Okay, so the sporophyte of the mature plant, recall the sporophyte is diploid, 2N. The sporophyte here that is composed of the capsule will open up and release these spores. It's the spore-producing plant, remember? So what are the spores? So are the spores haploid or diploid? Well, notice the process that the moss uses and all plants use to make their spores. They use meiotic cell division or meiosis. So meiosis always converts diploid cells to haploid cells. So spores have to be haploid here. Okay? So then the spores land somewhere where there's water, and then they grow. So each spore will grow into what? A spore grows into gametophyte. Okay, so here we see one of the spores start to germinate. We use that word a lot in plants. That means to grow or germinate by mitosis. So germinate. So a haploid spore will germinate and begin to grow into multicellular little branches here. Okay, starts to grow and sprout into the green structures that are only a few centimeters tall. And these are the gametophytes. Now here, I would like you to know that there's a male gametophyte and there's a female gametophyte. So the male gametophyte that grows from the spore will be haploid, multicellular haploid. And what cell will the male gametophyte make? Well, gametophyte means gamete-producing plant. So that means the male gametophyte would make sperm cells. Microscopically, this is what it's showing you. When we do the microscope lab on plants, we look at the male gametophyte under the microscope because you need a microscope to see the sperm, okay, and to see the structures that hold the sperm. That is something you can't see with the naked eye. You need a microscope. So that's why it's showing you here, like we're zooming in under the microscope, and we see these little structures that look like, again, little pods with sperm inside. So let's label that as sperm cells. And like the gametophyte, sperm cells are haploid. Okay, down here, we have another part of the gametophyte that forms the female. So this would be the female gametophyte. The female gametophyte is haploid. And the female gametophyte forms these structures that you can only see under the microscope that contain the cells that the female gametophyte make. And the female gametophyte make, that's right, egg cells. And egg cells would be haploid. Now what this is showing us is that, remember, mosses are dependent on water for fertilization. The sperm have to swim to the egg. And so the sperm here are released in these little, we show they're in little water droplets. So the sperm are swimming to the egg for fertilization to occur. Okay, so the sperm swim to the egg. And then that process would be called fertilization. Now what they're showing us here in the top left, they're showing us they're increasing the size of one of these female gametophytes. So we're looking at one of these female gametophytes zoomed in under a microscope. It's the only way you can see that. And it's trying to show you that fertilization occurs inside of the female gametophyte. So fertilization occurs inside of the female gametophyte as the sperm joins the egg. Now what do we call this cell? Right, we call it a zygote. Haploid or diploid? The zygote would be diploid. So then the zygote grows by mitosis. So you see how it's single-celled in this picture? And then they show us mitosis happening. And then see all these little individual cells growing? They're dividing from this original cell, mitosis. So what they want you to see is that this is the female gametophyte in green. And what we're seeing is that the sporophyte is growing out of the female gametophyte. So we'll call this the young sporophyte. And then it grows, and they're showing us the young sporophyte in this brownish color. And then it grows out of the female gametophyte and makes the mature sporophyte. Let's add the word mature here. And the mature sporophyte would then produce the capsule that would make the spores, and the cycle repeats. Let's finish this by color coding it. So 2N for diploid and N for haploid. So we're going to use yellow for haploid, yellow highlighter. So once again, spores are haploid, gametophytes are haploid, and gametes are haploid. Okay, I'm going to use my green highlighter for highlighting diploid. So sporophytes are always diploid, zygote diploid. This is diploid capsule. I guess we can highlight this female. About that here, female gametophyte here still would be. They're talking about the the female gametophyte that the young sporophyte grows out of there. Okay, so that is the moss life cycle, and I hope that was helpful. We'll see you in the next video.